The Deathworlders were a species unlike any other in the galaxy. From the moment they were born, life for them was never easy. Their homeworld was a harsh, unforgiving place where only the strongest, smartest, and most cunning could survive. The terrain was extreme. Mountains that scraped the sky, forests filled with predators far deadlier than any creature in neighboring systems, and oceans that could swallow entire cities without a trace. Violent storms, poisonous gases, and shifting tectonic plates made survival a daily challenge. But instead of weakening them, these conditions forged the Deathworlders into something extraordinary. Every individual who grew up there learned the rules of survival by heart. Adapt quickly, trust carefully, fight fiercely, and never show weakness. Their physical forms reflected their environment. Broad shoulders, long limbs, and thick, durable skin allowed them to endure extreme temperatures. Their eyes, sharp and unyielding, could spot danger from miles away, and their reflexes were lightning fast. They moved with purpose, each step precise, and every action was calculated to maximize survival. From the moment a Deathworlder could walk, they were trained in both strategy and combat. Lessons weren't taught in classrooms, they were lived. Young Deathworlders would track predators larger than themselves, learn to navigate deadly terrain, and even hunt in packs to develop teamwork, agility, and endurance. Mistakes were costly, sometimes fatal, and this constant pressure created a species that feared almost nothing. But physical strength alone did not make the Deathworlders apex predators. Their minds were equally formidable. From a young age, they were taught to think like hunters, to anticipate moves, predict outcomes, and plan several steps ahead. Their leaders were chosen not just for their brute strength, but for their intelligence, their ability to analyze situations, and their skill at strategy. Diplomacy existed, but only as a tool, a method to gain advantage without direct confrontation. They saw the universe as a vast hunting ground, and they studied every other species, every planet, and every star system they could reach. Knowledge was power, and the Deathworlders gathered it relentlessly. By the time a Deathworlder reached maturity, they were more than just survivors. They were warriors. Each individual carried weapons that had been perfected over centuries, designed to work in every type of terrain and against every type of opponent. Their technology was advanced but always practical, crafted to give them an edge in combat. Spacecraft were built for speed, endurance, and destruction. Armored suits enhanced strength and offered protection against harsh environments and enemy attacks. They had an uncanny ability to modify their tools to suit the mission at hand, blending innovation with instinct. Every aspect of their lives, from the food they ate to the battles they fought, was tailored to produce efficiency and superiority. The society of the Deathworlders was as disciplined as it was brutal. Hierarchies were strict and respect was earned, not given. Young warriors were constantly tested in simulated battles, survival exercises, and missions that pushed them to their limits. Failure was not tolerated lightly. Those who could not keep up were left behind, often permanently, in a way that reinforced the necessity of constant vigilance and improvement. Despite the harshness, there was honor among them. Loyalty to the pack, the clan, or the leader was absolute. Betrayal or cowardice was punished severely, not just as a matter of law, but as a principle of survival. In this environment, the strongest not only survived, they thrived, and their dominance became absolute. This combination of physical prowess, mental sharpness, and societal discipline allowed the Deathworlders to conquer their homeworld quickly. Rival species that had once shared their planet were either wiped out or driven into hiding. The Deathworlders adapted to every environment, overcame every threat, and expanded their control over territories that were once thought impossible to inhabit. This expansion was not just about survival, it was about dominance. The Deathworlders did not merely want to exist, they wanted to rule. And as they did, stories of their ferocity began to spread across the galaxy. Other species quickly learned to fear them. Tales of the Deathworlders' battles traveled faster than light itself. Entire fleets of enemies had been destroyed in single confrontations. Planets had been overtaken without the Deathworlders ever setting foot on them, simply by breaking the morale of their inhabitants and leaving no room for resistance. Alien species who thought themselves powerful realized that they had never encountered anything like the Deathworlders. Their name became synonymous with terror. Across distant star systems, leaders whispered warnings to their people. Avoid the Deathworlders at all costs, for no strategy, no army, no weapon had yet proven effective against them. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Deathworlders themselves remained remarkably confident, perhaps even arrogant. They had never known defeat on a scale that mattered, and they considered themselves at the top of the food chain not just on their planet, but in the galaxy. Other species were often dismissed as weak, inefficient, or naive. In the eyes of the Deathworlders, survival was not just a necessity. It was a right, and they had earned it through millennia of perfecting their skills, honing their instincts, and conquering everything in their path. Their dominance was unquestioned, and their pride reflected that reality. Even their culture celebrated strength and cunning. Art, music, and stories all glorified survival and conquest. Tales of legendary warriors, of battles fought and won against impossible odds, were taught to children as lessons. Young Deathworlders grew up aspiring to live up to the deeds of their ancestors. Every ceremony, every rite of passage, reinforced the idea that they were apex predators destined to rule. There was no room for doubt, and failure was a stain not just on the individual, but on their family and lineage. In a society like this, mediocrity was an alien concept. Yet, for all their strength, there was an underlying lesson that the Deathworlders lived by. The universe was harsh, and only those who adapted could thrive. Their success was not just because of their weapons or size, but because they understood the rules of survival in a way few others could. They studied patterns, learned from mistakes, and exploited weaknesses mercilessly. Their instincts were finely tuned to detect danger, and their reflexes allowed them to respond with precision. Every encounter, every hunt, every battle made them stronger, faster, and smarter. Over generations, this continuous cycle of challenge and adaptation created a species that truly believed it was unstoppable. By the end of this period, the Deathworlders had achieved something extraordinary. They had turned a hostile, dangerous planet into a realm they controlled completely. They had built a society that revered strength, intelligence, and survival above all else. And they had cultivated an identity that was feared across star systems. To them, the universe was theirs for the taking. They were apex predators in every sense of the word, not just physically, but mentally, socially, and technologically. They believed nothing in existence could challenge their dominance, and this belief, this absolute confidence in their invincibility, set the stage for everything that would come next. Because in a galaxy as vast as theirs, arrogance could be the most dangerous enemy of all. The Deathworlders, unmatched in every way they knew, were about to encounter something that would test everything they had ever believed about themselves. For now, they ruled their world with an iron grip, utterly convinced that their apex status was unshakable. But the galaxy, as it often does, had plans of its own. After centuries of dominance on their homeworld, the Deathworlders had grown confident in their abilities and their place in the galaxy. They had established control over their planet, honed their combat skills, and developed technologies that made them virtually untouchable. Every generation continued the traditions of the past, learning from the successes and failures of their ancestors. Life was structured, disciplined, and almost predictable, which suited the Deathworlders perfectly. They thrived in routine and control, always measuring potential threats carefully and eliminating them efficiently. Other species across nearby systems had long learned to avoid contact with the Deathworlders, and this absence of serious opposition reinforced the sense of invincibility in their society. For the Deathworlders, the galaxy seemed like a vast expanse of opportunity waiting to be conquered. Their scouts explored neighboring star systems, mapping planets and analyzing potential resources. They treated other species as less developed or inferior, often dismissing them without a second thought. To them, survival and strength were everything, and anything that couldn't match their standards of combat and endurance was considered unworthy of attention. This mindset allowed them to focus on improving themselves rather than worrying about distant civilizations. Each day, their confidence grew, bolstered by the countless victories they had achieved and the enemies they had defeated. They truly believed that nothing in the galaxy could match their power. But beyond the borders of Deathworlder-controlled space, the galaxy was changing in ways that the Deathworlders did not notice. Far-off civilizations, once isolated and fragmented, had started forming alliances. These species were watching the Deathworlders, studying their patterns of behavior, analyzing their strengths, and searching for weaknesses. Unlike the Deathworlders, who relied on brute force, these other civilizations had learned to combine strategy, technology, and intelligence in ways that were far more subtle and complex. They shared knowledge, coordinated movements, and trained together to prepare for a future in which the Deathworlders might threaten the stability of their regions. At first, these developments were invisible to the Deathworlders. They rarely ventured far from their own territories unless they were confident of victory. Any minor skirmishes they encountered were seen as trivial, easily dismissed as unworthy of serious attention. Their arrogance blinded them to the possibility that the galaxy was not a passive observer of their conquests. While the Deathworlders were busy perfecting their skills and celebrating their dominance, distant observers were quietly planning, learning, and adapting. This calm period, which seemed so peaceful and unthreatening, was actually the quiet before a storm that would soon reach their door. Within the Deathworlder society, life continued in its familiar rhythm. Young warriors trained rigorously, honing their instincts and reflexes. Leaders strategized for minor expansions and resource acquisitions, confident that they would face no real challenge. Scientific teams focused on improving weapons, ships, and armor, believing that technological superiority alone guaranteed victory. The Deathworlders' daily lives were filled with discipline, efficiency, and preparation, but all preparation was based on assumptions formed by past victories. They had never faced an enemy capable of outthinking them, so they assumed none existed. This sense of invincibility was both a strength and a blind spot. Meanwhile, the other species observing them began to gather intelligence more aggressively. Spies, scouts, and even diplomats were deployed to watch the Deathworlders' movements, record their strategies, and understand their decision-making process. Every action of the Deathworlders was analyzed, and patterns were noted. Their reliance on physical strength, their predictable combat styles, and their confidence in their superiority became points of focus. The observers began to prepare contingency plans, designing weapons and tactics specifically to counter the Deathworlders' strengths. They knew that a direct confrontation with a fully prepared Deathworlder force could be disastrous, so their approach required careful planning, patience, and coordination. Unaware of the growing threat, the Deathworlders continued to expand their influence across their star systems. They claimed planets rich in resources, enslaved or eliminated minor alien populations, and established fortified colonies. Each conquest reinforced their self-image as unstoppable predators. Celebrations marked every victory, and stories of heroism circulated throughout their society. They felt invincible, as though the galaxy itself existed to recognize and respect their power. But this overconfidence, though justified by their past experiences, began to create cracks in their perception. By ignoring the broader developments beyond their immediate reach, the Deathworlders were unknowingly setting themselves up for a challenge that could not be met with strength alone. In their pursuit of dominance, the Deathworlders also underestimated the value of intelligence and adaptability in other species. They saw technology and strategy as tools that could enhance brute force but never replace it. While they were highly skilled in combat, they did not fully appreciate the creativity, ingenuity, and teamwork of other civilizations. This misjudgment was critical. Many species that had survived against larger, stronger predators learned to exploit their intelligence to compensate for physical weakness. Over time, these species developed tactics that could neutralize even the most formidable opponents, and they were now preparing to apply these tactics to the Deathworlders. Life on the Deathworlder homeworld remained focused on personal and collective strength. Families trained their young in survival skills from the earliest age. Communities held contests and simulations to test strategic thinking under pressure. Leaders held councils to discuss tactics, resource allocation, and minor military campaigns. Every action, even routine ones, was an exercise in survival and efficiency. For the Deathworlders, this lifestyle was normal and even comforting. It was predictable, controllable, and successful. And in this environment, the belief in their invincibility grew stronger with each passing generation. Despite the apparent calm, subtle signs of change began to appear at the edges of Deathworlder space. Reports of unusual activity, missing ships, and unexplained disturbances occasionally reached their central command. But these incidents were dismissed as anomalies, natural disasters, or mistakes, hardly worth the attention of a species that had survived the harshest conditions imaginable. They were blind to the pattern forming beyond their vision, assuming that any threat could be crushed with force alone. Their confidence blinded them to the fact that the galaxy was moving in ways they could not control. The calm before the storm was also a time of reflection for some Deathworlders, though they were few and often ignored. A few leaders questioned whether their reliance on strength alone might leave them vulnerable in the long term. These voices were drowned out by the overwhelming majority, who saw no reason to doubt a system that had never failed them. Even as their scouts returned with reports of unknown fleets or signals from distant civilizations, the consensus was that any encounter would be trivial, a test of speed and firepower that they would inevitably win. This complacency, deeply ingrained in their culture, would soon prove to be their most dangerous weakness. As this period of quiet continued, the Deathworlders solidified their dominance internally, while unknowingly facing an external threat that was growing in complexity and coordination. The galaxy was changing in ways that they could not see, and the alliances being formed in secret were preparing to challenge them with tactics that the Deathworlders had never encountered. The species that had once seemed weak, uncoordinated, and insignificant were now becoming capable of a type of warfare that relied on intelligence, coordination, and strategy, rather than sheer force. The Deathworlders' past victories, which had built their confidence, were no longer enough to guarantee safety. This period, peaceful on the surface, was in reality a critical moment in galactic history. The Deathworlders, at the peak of their power and arrogance, were unknowingly walking into a situation that would test every skill, every lesson, and every assumption they had ever made. Their confidence, once their greatest strength, was now a vulnerability. The calm which seemed so reassuring was actually a warning, a signal that the galaxy was preparing for a confrontation unlike any they had faced before. The Deathworlders had spent so long mastering survival and dominance that they had forgotten one essential truth. No species, no matter how strong, is truly invincible in a universe that never stops changing. By the end of this period, the Deathworlders were at the height of their power. Their confidence was unmatched, their skills nearly perfect, and their society built to thrive in any challenge they had yet encountered. Yet just beyond their perception, forces were aligning that would confront them with challenges beyond brute strength. The calm before the storm was over. Soon the Deathworlders would learn that dominance and survival required more than just power. It required awareness, adaptability, and humility. The stage was set for a war that would challenge everything they believed about themselves, their superiority, and the nature of the galaxy itself. The first signs of real danger came suddenly, catching the Deathworlders completely off guard. For centuries they had believed themselves untouchable, masters of survival and dominance. They had conquered their world, expanded their territory, and earned a fearsome reputation across the galaxy. Nothing had ever challenged them seriously. Minor skirmishes, natural disasters, and occasional rival species had all been defeated easily. The Deathworlders had grown accustomed to victory, and their confidence in their supremacy was absolute. But this time, the universe had something entirely different in store. The first incident seemed small and almost inconsequential at first. Outposts on distant planets went silent without explanation. Ships that were sent to patrol or explore neighboring systems never returned. Scouts reported strange formations and advanced technology that they could not immediately understand. At first, the Deathworlders assumed these were minor mistakes, technical malfunctions, navigational errors, or the occasional rogue alien species trying to test them. Nothing in their experience suggested that these events were part of a coordinated attack. Their hubris blinded them to the possibility that these were the initial strikes of a strategic and sophisticated enemy. As the days passed, however, the situation escalated. Entire fleets disappeared without a trace, and communications with multiple planets went dark. The incidents were no longer isolated, they were systematic. It became clear that an external force was targeting the Deathworlders directly. Panic began to spread, although it was mixed with disbelief. Many leaders refused to believe that their forces could be in serious danger. After all, the Deathworlders had survived environmental hazards, rival predators, and countless wars over centuries. How could any species, no matter how clever, hope to challenge them? This disbelief was the first sign of a critical error. Arrogance had left them unprepared for a war that required more than brute strength. The attackers were unlike anything the Deathworlders had faced before. They were clever, organized, and technologically advanced. Their tactics were precise, designed to exploit weaknesses in the Deathworlders' strategies. While the Deathworlders had relied on overwhelming force and fear to dominate their opponents, these new enemies relied on intelligence, coordination, and planning. They observed the Deathworlders' behavior, anticipated their moves, and countered their attacks with surgical precision. Battles that the Deathworlders expected to win easily turned into traps. Entire operations failed before they even began. This was a type of warfare the Deathworlders had never encountered, and it shook them to the core. For the first time, the Deathworlders experienced confusion and uncertainty. Commanders who had always been decisive and fearless now debated endlessly over strategy. Young warriors trained to act with confidence and precision hesitated in the field. Soldiers who had never doubted victory began questioning their leaders, wondering if their society's understanding of strength was flawed. The psychological impact was enormous. Fear, something the Deathworlders had almost never felt on a large scale, began to take hold. The realization that they were not invincible was devastating. The war unfolded on multiple fronts. In some cases, the Deathworlders were ambushed while patrolling distant colonies. Entire garrisons were overwhelmed by advanced tactics and unexpected technology. In other cases, their fleets encountered traps that exploited their reliance on speed and brute force. Ships were disabled by precise attacks on weak points, and entire planetary defenses were neutralized before the Deathworlders could react. Every victory they had taken for granted became a fragile memory, and every assumption about their superiority was called into question. Their enemies were not only strong, they were adaptive, learning from each encounter and improving constantly. Within the Deathworlder command structure, the strain was enormous. Leaders who had once inspired loyalty through confidence and strength now struggled to maintain morale. Some argued for traditional approaches, relying on overwhelming force and aggressive retaliation. Others suggested new strategies, advocating for caution, reconnaissance, and adaptability. These debates, once a sign of healthy planning, now reflected deep uncertainty. The Deathworlders' usual clarity of purpose was replaced by confusion, frustration, and doubt. Their society, which had thrived on certainty and control, was now facing chaos. For ordinary Deathworlders, the war was terrifying. Families worried for their warriors, and entire communities were forced to relocate or take defensive positions. The psychological impact of constant attacks, the sudden loss of territory, and the failure of once reliable defenses created widespread fear. It was no longer just a matter of pride. Their survival was at stake. The Deathworlders had long believed that strength guaranteed safety, but now they realized that intelligence, strategy, and adaptability could challenge even the most powerful. This was a lesson they were learning the hard way, through losses that could not be ignored or dismissed. The initial shock of the war forced the Deathworlders to reevaluate everything they had believed about themselves. Their reliance on brute strength and fear as tools of dominance was no longer sufficient. They began to understand that victory required more than power. It required foresight, coordination, and flexibility. However, adapting was not easy for a species that had spent generations relying on instinct and experience, rather than subtlety and strategy. Many struggled to adjust, clinging to old methods even as evidence mounted that those methods were failing. Despite the chaos, some Deathworlders began to show remarkable resilience. Leaders who could combine their combat experience with quick thinking and innovation started to find ways to counter the new threats. Young warriors, trained to act instinctively, adapted to new technologies and tactics faster than expected. Units that were previously underestimated began to organize, learning from each encounter and gradually regaining confidence. These small successes were crucial. They reminded the Deathworlders that while their assumptions had been challenged, their inherent skills and determination were not lost. Survival was still possible, but it would require learning, flexibility, and humility. As the war continued, the scale of the challenge became undeniable. Planets that had been under Deathworlder control for centuries were at risk. Supply lines were disrupted, communication networks compromised, and morale fluctuated wildly. Every day brought new surprises, as the enemy adapted to Deathworlder tactics in ways that made each battle unpredictable. The Deathworlders, once feared across star systems, were now facing a force that could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast them. For the first time in their history, they were truly tested. This phase of the war also revealed the importance of unity and leadership. Some factions within Deathworlder society attempted to act independently, following personal ambition rather than collective strategy. These divisions only made the situation worse, highlighting the dangers of pride and overconfidence. Leaders who could coordinate their forces, share intelligence, and plan collaboratively began to make a difference, showing that survival depended not just on individual strength, but on teamwork and shared purpose. Through these trials, the Deathworlders learned valuable lessons about the nature of warfare and survival. They realized that dominance alone was fragile and that arrogance could be deadly. They understood that victory required more than brute force, that intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation were just as critical as strength and speed. The war was no longer simply a contest of physical power. It had become a test of character, resilience, and the ability to evolve under pressure. By the end of this period, the Deathworlders had faced their first true challenge in centuries. The initial shock of the war had shaken them to their core, but it had also forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Their confidence had been a double-edged sword. It had fueled their dominance, but it had also left them unprepared for a sophisticated and intelligent enemy. The Deathworlders now understood that survival in the galaxy required more than instinct and power. It required continuous learning, adaptability, and respect for forces beyond one's immediate understanding. This phase of the story marked a turning point. The Deathworlders, once the uncontested apex predators of their region, were now forced to evolve or risk annihilation. The war had arrived unannounced, and its lessons would shape the remainder of their history. They had been humbled, challenged, and terrified, but within that struggle lay the potential for growth and renewal. The Deathworlders had always survived the deadliest environments, and now they were learning that even in the vast, complex galaxy, survival depended on more than raw strength. It depended on wisdom, strategy, and the ability to adapt to challenges they had never imagined. The war had arrived in full force, and the Deathworlders were no longer simply facing challenges. They were facing the collapse of everything they had once believed about themselves. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a creeping realization that their invincibility was an illusion. The strategies and instincts that had kept them alive for centuries were failing against an enemy that was clever, coordinated, and relentless. Losses mounted, and with each defeat the confidence of the Deathworlders faltered. Their society, once proud and unwavering, was beginning to experience the psychological strain of true adversity for the first time. At the heart of this struggle were the leaders. Commanders who had always been decisive found themselves paralyzed by the scale and unpredictability of the attacks. Plans that would have guaranteed victory in the past were failing repeatedly. Some leaders insisted on traditional approaches, overwhelming force, aggressive offensives, and brute intimidation, while others advocated caution, surveillance, and adaptation. These disagreements caused friction at the highest levels of command, creating confusion and sometimes paralysis in the chain of command. Soldiers who were used to clear, confident orders began to hesitate, unsure of how to respond to constantly changing threats. For the ordinary Deathworlders, the impact was deeply personal. Families mourned fallen warriors, and entire communities were forced to live under constant alert. The sound of alarms, the sight of destroyed outposts, and the knowledge that even their strongest defenses could fail created an atmosphere of fear that had never existed before. Children were evacuated from cities, and young warriors were pushed into combat situations far more dangerous than anything they had trained for. The Deathworlders had always known how to fight and survive, but the scale and sophistication of this war exposed vulnerabilities that had been hidden for generations. Survival was no longer guaranteed by instinct alone. It required adaptation, intelligence, and teamwork. One of the most devastating aspects of the conflict was the Deathworlders' realization that their pride and confidence, which had once been their greatest strengths, were now liabilities. They had underestimated the enemy for centuries, assuming that no force in the galaxy could match them. This arrogance had prevented them from fully preparing for the kind of strategic warfare they were now facing. Every battle became a lesson in humility. Tactics that had worked flawlessly in the past were now being turned against them. and every victory they had once counted on seemed fragile. The psychological blow was as damaging as the physical losses. As the war continued, the Deathworlders struggled to adapt. They were forced to reevaluate everything they had learned about combat, strategy, and survival. Units that had once operated independently had to begin coordinating closely, sharing intelligence and resources to survive. Commanders began experimenting with new tactics, sometimes combining brute force with subtle strategies learned from studying the enemy. This period of adaptation was chaotic. Successes were rare and failures were frequent and devastating. Yet despite the hardships, the Deathworlders showed remarkable resilience. They were a species forged in extreme conditions, and while their arrogance had been dangerous, their determination and strength remained. Morale became one of the most critical battles of all. Soldiers who had grown up believing themselves invincible had to come to terms with fear, uncertainty, and the possibility of death. Some broke under the pressure, abandoning posts or refusing orders. Others rose to the occasion, demonstrating courage and ingenuity in situations that would have overwhelmed even the most seasoned warriors. Leaders worked tirelessly to maintain discipline and focus, using both incentives and strict consequences to keep the ranks organized. In this way, the war became not only a physical struggle, but also a psychological one, testing the very character of the Deathworlders as a species. Territorial losses were a constant source of pressure. Planets that had been secure under Deathworlder control for generations were now under threat, and entire colonies faced the possibility of annihilation. Supply lines were disrupted and communication networks were compromised. The Deathworlders had never faced an enemy capable of such coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. Their infrastructure, once a source of power and control, now became a vulnerability. Each loss reinforced the lesson that survival required more than strength. It required flexibility, strategy, and the ability to anticipate the enemy's moves. This stage of the war also highlighted the importance of learning from failure. The Deathworlders, who had been trained to succeed through instinct and aggression, now had to study each encounter, understand why they had failed, and adapt quickly. Commanders held rapid post-battle analyses, scrutinizing every decision, every movement, and every assumption. Young warriors were taught to observe carefully and to think critically, rather than relying solely on reflexes and brute force. Over time, these adaptations began to yield small victories, strategic wins that were not based on overwhelming power, but on careful planning and insight. Even as the Deathworlders struggled, they began to recognize the value of humility. Their society, which had long celebrated dominance and superiority, now had to confront its limitations. Pride, once a source of strength, was tempered by experience and reflection. Leaders who had previously dismissed advice from younger or less experienced warriors began to listen. Communities that had relied on isolation and control now collaborated more closely, sharing resources and intelligence in ways that had not been necessary before. This shift in mindset, though born of necessity, was essential for their survival. The psychological toll of the war cannot be overstated. The Deathworlders, who had once moved through life with confidence and certainty, were forced to confront fear, doubt, and vulnerability on a scale never experienced before. Dreams of conquest were replaced by the harsh reality of survival. Stories of heroism still circulated, but now they were tinged with the knowledge of real danger and the possibility of failure. The experience reshaped their identity as a species. They were no longer simply apex predators. They were warriors forced to adapt to an unpredictable and cunning enemy. Amidst the chaos, moments of resilience shone through. Some units managed to repel attacks against overwhelming odds. Innovative strategies emerged from unexpected quarters. Leaders who had once relied solely on brute strength began combining it with intelligence and foresight, creating hybrid tactics that allowed them to survive and even gain small advantages. These victories, though rare, were crucial for maintaining morale and proving that the Deathworlders were not defeated. They were learning, evolving, and growing stronger in ways that extended beyond physical prowess. The experience also forged stronger bonds within Deathworlder society. Soldiers and civilians alike had to rely on each other for survival. Communities became more cohesive and loyalty became even more important. Betrayal or cowardice, once treated as a matter of principle, now had tangible consequences for survival. The challenges of the war emphasized that individual skill, while important, was insufficient without collaboration and trust. This realization gradually transformed the way the Deathworlders approached both strategy and social organization. By the end of this phase of the conflict, the Deathworlders had undergone a profound transformation. Their understanding of themselves, their enemies, and the nature of survival had changed dramatically. The war had stripped away arrogance, exposed vulnerabilities, and forced them to confront the reality that strength alone was not enough. They had been tested in every way possible, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and the lessons were harsh but essential. They were learning that survival in a galaxy full of intelligent and adaptive opponents required more than dominance. It required humility, adaptability, and wisdom. This period also set the stage for the next phase of their journey. The Deathworlders, once invincible, now knew what it meant to struggle against a superior enemy. They had tasted fear, experienced loss, and understood the consequences of underestimating their adversaries. The psychological and emotional growth they experienced during this period was as significant as any battlefield victory. They were no longer simply hunters or conquerors. They were a species being reshaped by the pressures of true war, forced to evolve beyond instinct and strength alone. The lessons learned during this time would guide the Deathworlders in the battles to come. They realized that victory required a combination of skill, intelligence, adaptability, and the courage to face uncertainty. They understood that survival was not guaranteed by past achievements or inherited strength. Most importantly, they discovered that even apex predators could fall if they failed to recognize the complexity and cunning of the universe around them. The war had humbled them, challenged them, and ultimately prepared them for the challenges that lay ahead, ensuring that they would emerge from this crucible stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. After enduring the chaos, fear, and losses of the war, the Deathworlders found themselves in a new reality. They had survived the most challenging period in their history, but survival did not come without cost. Entire fleets had been destroyed, once secure planets were lost, and countless warriors had fallen. Their society, which had once thrived on certainty, dominance, and the belief in their invincibility, was now forced to confront the harsh truth. The universe was far bigger, more complex, and far less forgiving than they had ever imagined. For the first time, the Deathworlders understood that power alone could not guarantee safety. Dominance without wisdom was fragile, and arrogance could be deadly. Despite these losses, the Deathworlders began the painstaking process of rebuilding. Their cities, damaged or destroyed during the conflict, were reconstructed with improved designs to withstand future attacks. Technologies that had once been focused solely on offense were now adapted to improve defense and resilience. Entire training programs were revised, emphasizing not just strength and instinct but intelligence, strategy, and adaptability. Warriors were taught to anticipate, plan, and adapt to changing circumstances, rather than relying solely on brute force. This new approach did not replace their natural skills. It enhanced them, creating a generation of Deathworlders who were stronger, smarter, and more capable than ever before. The experience of facing a cunning enemy left a lasting impression on their leaders. Commanders who had once relied on aggressive dominance learned to value patience, observation, and coordination. Strategies that had previously seemed unnecessary or secondary now became essential. They realized that victory in future conflicts would require a balance between power and precision, speed and thoughtfulness, instinct and intelligence. Decision-making became more nuanced and planning became more thorough. Leaders began consulting with their advisors and warriors more frequently, recognizing that collaboration and shared insight were now crucial for survival. Morale, once shattered by the relentless attacks, slowly began to recover. Soldiers who had faced the worst of the war and survived returned with a new sense of pride, not just in their strength, but in their resilience and adaptability. Communities celebrated the survival of their people, even as they mourned the losses. These victories, though hard-won, reinforced the idea that the Deathworlders were capable of growth and renewal. The war had tested them in ways they had never imagined, and emerging from it alive and capable was a testament to their enduring spirit. The Deathworlders also began to reflect on the lessons of humility that the war had taught them. Their arrogance, born of centuries of dominance, had left them vulnerable. They had underestimated the intelligence and coordination of other species, assuming that survival and strength alone would protect them. Now they understood that respect for the complexity of the galaxy and awareness of potential threats were essential. This shift in perspective did not weaken them, it made them wiser. They retained their strength and combat prowess but now complemented it with a newfound sense of caution, insight, and strategic thinking. In addition to rebuilding physically and mentally, the Deathworlders also began to rebuild their relationships with other species. The war had demonstrated that isolation and aggression alone were insufficient to ensure security. They began to approach diplomacy and alliances with greater care, recognizing that collaboration could provide strategic advantages in ways that brute force could not. These alliances were not easy for a species used to dominance. They required negotiation, compromise, and trust. But over time, the Deathworlders learned to value these partnerships as tools for both security and influence. The cultural impact of the war was profound. Stories and legends now celebrated not only strength and conquest but also resilience, adaptability, and the ability to learn from failure. Children were taught that true greatness required both courage and wisdom. Heroes of the war were honored not only for their victories but for their resourcefulness and strategic thinking. This cultural evolution ensured that future generations would grow up understanding the importance of balance. Power tempered by intelligence, confidence balanced by humility, and instinct guided by foresight. Economically and technologically, the Deathworlders emerged from the war more advanced than before. They had been forced to innovate under pressure, finding creative solutions to unprecedented challenges. Ships were redesigned for both offense and defense. Weapon systems were refined and communication networks were strengthened to withstand sabotage. Training regimens incorporated strategy simulations, tactical planning, and teamwork exercises. By integrating these lessons, the Deathworlders transformed the hardships of the war into a foundation for long-term resilience and capability. The psychological growth of the species was equally remarkable. Fear, which had once been alien to the Deathworlders, became a tool rather than a weakness. They learned to recognize danger, anticipate threats, and respond strategically. Confidence, once unchallenged and blind, became more measured, grounded in experience rather than assumption. The Deathworlders retained their pride, but it was now informed by wisdom and caution. This combination of strength, intelligence, and humility ensured that they were better prepared for any future conflict, no matter how unpredictable or formidable. The war also left a permanent mark on the structure of Deathworlder society. Leadership became more flexible, allowing for the input of experienced warriors and strategic advisors. Decision-making became more collaborative, with greater emphasis on planning and analysis. Communities were more tightly knit, sharing resources, intelligence, and support more effectively. This social cohesion enhanced their ability to respond to threats and reinforced the importance of loyalty, trust, and collective effort. The Deathworlders had learned that survival depended not only on individual skill, but on the strength of the society as a whole. In the broader context of the galaxy, the Deathworlders' transformation was evident. Once feared as unstoppable predators, they were now recognized as a species that had endured profound challenges and emerged wiser and stronger. Their reputation shifted from simple fear to respect, not just for their power but for their resilience and adaptability. Other species began to approach interactions with the Deathworlders differently, aware that they were no longer merely violent conquerors but a civilization capable of strategy, learning, and long-term planning. Even as they rebuilt and evolved, the Deathworlders never forgot the lessons of the war. They understood that dominance could never be assumed, and that vigilance, preparation, and adaptability were essential to survival. Future generations were trained not only to fight but to think, anticipate, and innovate. The culture of the Deathworlders became one that valued both strength and intelligence, courage and caution, instinct and foresight. This evolution ensured that they were no longer merely apex predators, they were apex survivors, capable of navigating a galaxy that was far more dangerous and complex than they had once imagined. Ultimately, the Deathworlders emerged from the war transformed but unbroken. They had faced the greatest challenge of their history, confronted fear and loss, and endured hardship on a scale that had never been seen in their civilization. Through resilience, adaptability, and strategic growth, they not only survived but also became stronger, wiser, and more capable of meeting future threats. Their society had evolved in every sense, physically, mentally, socially, and culturally, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would guide their decisions in the future. The experience left a lasting impression. Power alone is never enough. Dominance can be fleeting if not supported by strategy, intelligence, and humility. The Deathworlders learned that survival required constant awareness, careful planning, and the ability to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. They understood that the galaxy was full of unpredictable challenges, and only by combining their natural strengths with wisdom could they maintain their position and protect their people. By the conclusion of this period, the Deathworlders were no longer the same species that had begun the story. They retained their formidable physical abilities and combat skills, but they were now tempered by experience, insight, and humility. They had learned to respect the complexities of the galaxy, to value collaboration, and to anticipate threats rather than assuming invincibility. The war had tested every aspect of their civilization, and through that crucible, they had evolved into a stronger, more adaptable, and wiser species. In the end, the Deathworlders' survival and transformation served as a testament to resilience. They had faced what they thought was impossible and endured. They had confronted their fears, rebuilt their society, and redefined their identity. The galaxy had forced them to evolve, and they had done so successfully. They were no longer just apex predators. They were apex survivors, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring, equipped not just with strength but with wisdom, strategy, and the knowledge that true dominance requires more than raw power.